Okay. Good morning, everyone. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are currently in Jabuktuk, which is situated in Mamagi, the ancestral and traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. My name is Emily Kelway, and I am the Toronto Centre of Excellence and Policy Coordinator for Making the Shift. If you don't know which room you're in, we are in room 503 for the session titled EDI Approaches Within Our Work and What We Can Learn. This session focuses on bold and inclusive approaches and strategies that work to support the diversity of the youth we engage with. As part of the Away Home Canada stream, this session is sponsored by the Home Depot Canada Foundation. We would like to thank them for their generous support and dedication to preventing youth homelessness and their contributions to our collective impact in this space. Unfortunately, one of our presenters, Kathy Fournier, is not able to be here today due to an emergency. She was meant to speak about infusing Indigenous ceremony and culture into homelessness programming in Canada using Andayang as a case study for Indigenous youth homelessness in Canada. Andayang, meaning Our Home in Ojibwe, is a Housing First for Youth project led by and for Indigenous people rooted in ceremony and Indigenous teachings. If you'd like to learn more about Andayang and more specifically about Kathy's presentation, just reach out to me afterwards and I can connect you with more resources on Andayang as a project and as well as Kathy's presentation. Nonetheless, we have two amazing presentations today and now extra time for questions as well. As a queer person, I am both excited and honored to introduce you to our wonderful presenters who have done amazing work in this space, and I've had the privilege of getting to know a bit better over the last little while. First, I will bring, you're already up here, I will introduce you to Dr. Alex Abramovich, a renowned scientist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, or CAMH, and an associate professor at the University of Toronto. He is joined by the wonderful Nicole Elkington, a research coordinator at CAMH who has worked extensively in the field of 2S LGBTQ research. They will be discussing their evaluation of the Blue Door Inclusion Supportive Housing Program for 2S LGBTQ plus youth. Thanks.
Perfect. Great. Thanks so much. Great to see so many folks joining us this morning. So welcome to our panel. Nicole and I are going to get the panel started off with the first presentation, which is going to focus on the evaluation that we've been conducting on Blue Door's inclusion program located in York Region, Ontario. And as Emily mentioned, it's a specialized supportive housing program for 2S LGBTQ youth.
We have a lot on the agenda today. But as a brief guide for the next 20 minutes, we'll be presenting some background information on 2S LGBTQ youth homelessness in Canada to provide some context. We will then discuss the Blue Door Inclusion Program and share main findings from our evaluation to date, as well as some main recommendations for programs serving youth experiencing homelessness.
Great. So we're just going to start off with some brief introductions. My name is Alex Abramovich. I go by he, him pronouns. And as Emily had mentioned, I'm a scientist at the Institute for Mental Health Policy Research at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, and an associate professor at the Dalalana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. I hold a Canada Research Chair in 2S LGBTQ youth homelessness and mental health.
And my name is Nicole Elkington. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a research coordinator at CAMH, working in Dr. Abramovich's lab. Okay, so how do we improve 2S LGBTQ plus population-based programs and ensure they meet the needs of youth? Well, this was our question and the aim of our evaluation for our research. A brief overview of 2S LGBTQ plus youth homelessness across Canada.
Great, so I'm going to start off with sharing some background information before we get into the evaluation and some of the preliminary results. So because we're presenting an evaluation of a population-based housing program, I think it's important to understand why there's a need for population-based housing programs, specifically for 2S LGBTQ youth. So I'm sure, as many of you already know, 2S LGBTQ youth are disproportionately represented among young people experiencing homelessness, and they make up 25 to 40% of the homeless youth population across North America. 2S LGBTQ youth tend to experience homelessness at younger ages and for longer episodes of time compared to cisgender and heterosexual youth. And this leads to more issues in the long run, and it also makes it more difficult for youth to safely and successfully exit homelessness. So queer and trans youth homelessness has for a long time been conceptualized and understood, talked about as a big city problem in which queer and trans youth are believed to experience homelessness only in larger urban settings. And this, of course, is not true. And this, given that so many queer and trans folks exist everywhere across the country, in all provinces and cities and communities, and unfortunately also experience homelessness in rural and urban communities across the country. I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are difficulties in measuring population size among 2S LGBTQ individuals who are experiencing homelessness across Canada. And this has to do, with a variety of reasons. For example, including the prevalence of hidden homelessness among 2S LGBTQ individuals, particularly for those who are living in rural and remote communities.
The whole reason I became homeless is because I came out. Stevie, 16 years old.
And that is a common sort of quote, common narrative that we hear from young people across all of the projects that we work on, and for many of the young people who we speak with. So we know that identity-based family conflict resulting from a young person coming out as 2S LGBTQ is really the most frequently cited reason that queer and trans youth experience homelessness. Of course, there are additional factors and sources of homelessness, such as, including exiting public systems, such as child welfare and the juvenile justice system into homelessness, racism, poverty, and unstable and insufficient employment. Some 2S LGBTQ individuals are more likely to experience homelessness and poverty compared to others. So, for example, Indigenous, queer, and trans youth experience homelessness at disproportionate rates. 2S LGBTQ youth consistently report issues regarding safety, and this would be, within shelters and housing programs, especially for youth who navigate systems with multiple marginalized identities and are subjected to multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, transphobia, and homophobia. Queer and trans youth are regularly forced to choose between unsafe situations, and this has to do with the lack of safe and affirming housing programs, and also report having to pick and choose, which aspects of their identity are more important to be addressed, included actually when accessing programs. And this is something that we often hear from youth. So, for example, queer and trans Indigenous youth often talk about having to choose between accessing an Indigenous-focused program versus a 2S LGBTQ program. And if they choose the queer and trans-focused program, then they won't be able to connect with cultural practices and access, cultural supports, including elders, or spiritual and cultural guidance. And this is something that we continue to hear from youth, having to pick and choose, which part of you are you going to show and which part of your needs will be met. Homelessness, discrimination, and stigma also have very serious consequences on the health and well-being of 2S LGBTQ people. And this is often what leads to the significant mental health issues and increased alcohol and substance use that we tend to see in research. So not much to do with the fact that a person identifies as queer or trans, but everything to do with the discrimination, the violence, and the stigma.
Over the past 7 years, Canada's first population-based housing programs for 2S LGBTQ plus individuals have opened. On the screen here are some of the population-based housing programs across Canada. Among them is Blue Door's Inclusion Program, which we'll be discussing today. There are currently a handful of these programs operating across the country, offering a variety of housing models, including long-term and more independent-style housing, as well as shorter-term with more intensive support available. A major difference between these programs and many of the other housing programs that exist is that all these programs have been designed with the needs of 2S LGBTQ at the center of all aspects of the program and on providing 2S LGBTQ plus folk with safe, affirming, and inclusive places to live.
So in 2019, my team and I led a study that focused on providing a snapshot of 2S LGBTQ youth homelessness in York Region. So York Region consists of 9 local municipalities of urban, semi-rural, and rural size and density, and is located just north of Toronto. And one of the major recommendations that resulted from this study was the need for 2S LGBTQ population-based housing programs in York Region. That was something that came across very loudly and very clearly. So Blue Door, which is a housing agency, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, located in York Region, responded to our study's call for action. And they responded by launching the Inclusion Program in February 2021. Which is York Region's first population-based housing program specifically for 2S LGBTQ youth. So Inclusion is a supportive housing program in which youth pay a portion of their rent if they are able to do so. And the program, it's quite small. So the program we're talking about today has capacity to support approximately 4 to 5 youth at any time in single occupancy bedrooms for a flexible length of stay, typically for approximately 1 year or so. They're pet-friendly, and I mention this because, as many of you know, that is very difficult to find pet-friendly housing programs. And it is a highly independent style program. So, for example, there's no 24-hour staff, but rather youth are supported by a peer mentor throughout the week. It's okay. Wait, is this? Is it? Oh, okay. All right. So as an innovative new program, evaluation was an essential component for management to demonstrate the effectiveness of the program and also for areas of improvement with the plan to utilize the evaluation results to improve the inclusion program, to secure future program funding, and then also to inspire similar programs, whether it be across the region, across Canada, or even around the world to open. And so there have been few evaluations of transitional housing programs as well as supportive housing programs. And this has really resulted in a limited pool of evidence, I would say, for organizations and for policymakers to turn to when developing inclusive services and policies, particularly when developing population-based housing programs for queer and trans individuals. So currently there's minimal understanding of how 2S LGBTQ youth access and utilize housing programs and whether or not these programs actually lead to positive outcomes for 2S LGBTQ youth and whether or not they actually even help them successfully exit homelessness. So these are questions that we have had over time and haven't been able to really fully answer.
Okay. Is it better if I talk closer here?
For translation and for online.
Okay, I'm wondering.
Here.
Okay, thank you. So we utilize the longitudinal mixed method approach following a developmental evaluation framework, which is characterized by repeated cycles of data collection, feedback, reflection, and adaptation. Rather than waiting for a final report at the end of the study, feedback is looped back to the organization in a more frequent and timely manner, allowing for results and recommendations to be implemented more quickly.
So the evaluation was put in place to document the experiences and the needs of youth while they're living at the inclusion program, and then as well as for up to 1 year after they leave the program and move out. And through this evaluation, we have also been documenting the experiences and the perspectives of staff to determine strengths and areas for improvement and whether the inclusion program was appropriately meeting the needs of the youth who are accessing the program. Evidence-based recommendations are provided throughout the evaluation to help improve the inclusion program and to ensure continued success. And so we've had a number of key objectives going into this project, and I'm just going to go over these the 3 main objectives with you. And so the first would be to document the experiences and perspectives of program residents and program staff. 2, to assess and measure changes in mental health, alcohol and substance use, community participation, housing stability, employment status, and school enrollment. And then 3rd, to determine the strengths and gaps of inclusion programming and provide recommendations to ensure that 2S LGBTQ youth will be able to transition into safe, stable, and independent housing.
Data collection. So we, the evaluation team, worked closely with program residents and staff on a regular and ongoing basis while respecting and sustaining the independent nature of the program. Inclusion residents and staff are meaningfully engaged through formal interviews and focus groups and conversations throughout the entire evaluation process to further understand program dynamics and structure, including participant enrollment, services offered, staff and resident meetings, and day-to-day life at Inclusion. Inclusion residents are invited to complete surveys and in-depth one-on-one interviews every 3 to 4 months. Youth also receive monthly virtual check-in surveys while they're living at Inclusion. These surveys take about 5 minutes to complete and focus on the mental health and any goals they might be working on. Once the youth move out of the program, we continue to follow them for 1 year after they move out of Inclusion with surveys and one-on-one interviews, again, every 3 to 4 months. A community advisory board is made up of approximately 6 members and was created at the beginning of the project and meets 3 times a year to advise on a variety of aspects of the projects, including data collection tools, interpretation of findings, recommendation, and knowledge translation activities. Youth and staff from external population-based housing programs were also invited to participate in one-on-one interviews to understand their experiences at similar programs and to better understand to what extent Inclusion complements, duplicates, overlaps, and works similarly to other programs. Youth and CAB members were compensated for their participation in all stages of the study. We provided approximately 2 to 3 interim reports per year, and a final report will be submitted at the end of the project. Dr. Abramovich also met with the program manager every 3 to 4 months to discuss findings and recommendations and go over the reports and any plans that the program had in place to address the findings and recommendations. This approach positioned the evaluators as facilitators of change and actively engaged stakeholders in the research process, interpretation of findings, and knowledge translation activities.
Great. So to date, we have submitted 3 reports to Blue Door, and our final report will be submitted in January, sometime in January. So we have summarized the main findings, focused on what is working, like what about the program is working, areas for improvement, and then some of the key recommendations based on our most recent report. And so what I'm going to be sharing with you is sort of based on, like I said, the most recent report. Our final report will sort of look at the data in a more longitudinal format. So we're not really doing that sort of longitudinal comparison at this point in time. We're just going to share with you some of the most recent preliminary findings. So what about the program is working? Well, there are a number of aspects, a number of things that are working really well about the program. So first of all, the program's ability to provide youth with a safe place to live and housing stability, I would say that is absolutely key. Because as I mentioned earlier, safety is such a major concern for so many 2S LGBTQ youth who are experiencing homelessness. Well, safety has not been a concern for the youth who are living at Inclusion. Youth have also recently noted that socializing with their housemates has positively contributed to their experiences at the Inclusion program. And I mention this because, that I think that is one of the great things actually about these types of population-based programs is to have your own sort of identity and your experience normalized rather than sort of being like the one like queer youth in a program and just feeling like other. Well, that's not the case in a program like this. Obviously, there's that shared lived experience. And so housemate dynamics really does seem closely related with concerns about clarity of program expectations and satisfaction with shared household cleaning as well. And I think that it should be noted that this type of dynamic has really varied over the course of the evaluation, and it is contingent on who is living at the house, and that obviously changes. It's a very small program with 4 youth, but that dynamic can really change depending on who moves in, who moves out. And then thirdly, youth confirm that our reported findings, so the reports that we submit to Blue Door, are representative of their experiences and their needs, and that has been really important to ensure that what we're sharing does sort of resonate with the youth, and as well as with staff. Staff have also confirmed that our evaluation reports are helpful and that they're aware of some recommendations that have already been implemented at the program. And finally, The inclusion program provides youth with a 2S LGBTQ affirming and inclusive environment, which has been an asset for youth residents and really aligns with the first point that I mentioned about safety and inclusion providing a safe living environment for youth. Yeah, okay. I think that's...
Wonderful. Same slide.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. So while the program provides many benefits, our evaluation identified some areas for improvement, all of which the program is well aware of and is working towards. The areas for improvement and additional support specifically include additional mental health and trauma-informed support, access to physical and gender-affirming care, additional support and resources focused on food security, access to additional staff at the program, and lastly, housing support post-inclusion. So the need for increased mental health support is not unique to the inclusion program, but is echoed throughout housing programs across Canada, including population-based programs. The challenge is often that many of these programs, inclusion included, are highly independent in nature. So they're not necessarily meant for youth in crisis or youth with high and complex mental health needs.
Okay, so as we come to the end of this evaluation, as I mentioned, we'll be submitting our final report in January. We're still collecting data, but we are coming to the end of this 2-year evaluation. We have some key findings about the 2S LGBTQ youth who have accessed the program over the last 2 years. And so the majority of youth reported, as Nicole mentioned, that their mental health is a concern. And that is not a surprise at all. I would say that pretty much every single project that I have ever worked on, that is really the typical sort of first finding is around that piece about, having mental health concerns, not having your mental health needs being met. And I would say that's consistent, as I mentioned, with my work, but as well as with other research in the area, as well as, literature in the area. And so all of the participants reported, as we mentioned, they have these surveys. So typically when we meet with the youth, they'll complete a pretty in-depth survey that assesses different components of their sort of mental health and well-being, and then an in-depth interview. And then we also do those monthly surveys as well. And so all of the youth experienced moderate to severe anxiety. Follow-up suggests reductions in anxiety over time at inclusion. And half of the participants scored in the severe or moderately severe ranges for depression. And the follow-ups actually suggest increases in depression over time. And so the majority of youth reported experiencing some level of food insecurity across all of the time points that we have met with young people. And while inclusion has increased the number of food supports to youth via food bins, they renovated their entire kitchen space, they added a chest freezer, making sure that there are meals available to youth. This has also coincided with increasing grocery prices. Okay, so our main recommendations to date include implementing regular feedback provided by the evaluation and by youth. This is for the program, obviously, to implement this regular sort of feedback. And then to facilitate access to mental health supports. I would say that's sort of a recommendation across the board. And to provide resources and support with crisis planning for youth. And I do think that is a sort of a tricky one, especially with the more independent programs that aren't necessarily they're not put in place to meet complex mental health needs, but somehow, that always comes up, and so that is a need that will always be there, no matter how independent the housing program is. Ensuring food security, so making sure that options are readily available and accessible to young people. And then providing increased structured programming, which is another one. If it's a highly independent program, and on one hand, that's a piece that I think a lot of youth really, really like about the program, but then it's like they also want the structured programming. So it's just trying to find the balance and, how do you provide that? And so, including, providing support with finding housing and next steps. And so with our recommendations, I think it's important to note that Blue Door has already made a number of changes to the program. And I think that is actually the beauty of this type of an evaluation, like a developmental evaluation framework, because we're not waiting for that final report to submit to the program, but we're meeting throughout the project pretty frequently so that they're well aware of what is needed. And so to date, the program has been really great about implementing feedback rather quickly. As I briefly mentioned, the program has worked to improve food security. That was a big one. And they did this rather quickly. They did an entire renovation of their kitchen space, really opened up the space. They added food bins and supported youth with grocery shopping. Then the basement of the house and the kitchen were renovated as a response to some of the reported needs of youth who are living in the program. And then Inclusion continues to actively explore opportunities to add a mental health professional to the team, which I think is a challenge for many programs.
So lastly, we have some general recommendations for all programs serving youth that can help to make them safer for 2S LGBTQ youth. So including questions regarding pronouns, chosen name, and gender identity and sexual orientation on intake forms, respect and accept clients' chosen names and pronouns, ensure services include all gender washrooms, equip services with 2S LGBTQ plus affirming resources, and mandatory 2S LGBTQ training for all staff. It's been a long road, but it's good finally. It's good to hang out with other trans people and having it be no big deal. Like the three of us just sat around the table and just sipped coffee and made breakfast together. Having that connection and not having to worry about people not knowing who I am or not coming out to them about like 100 times.
Great. And so, population-based programs like Inclusion, as we have discovered, provide safe and affirming spaces for 2S LGBTQ people to exist authentically and not have to worry about safety constantly. But I do think it's as important as these types of programs are, it's also important to acknowledge that this is not the only solution, and nor should it be the only solution. I think that now more than ever, I think that all programs really need to be held accountable and really need to actually do the work to become safe and inclusive and affirming spaces for all youth. I just don't think we're at a point now where it's not acceptable anymore. We shouldn't be having these same conversations every single conference. I think it's time, right? Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. That's so exciting project. We'll save the questions until the end. I'll bring up the Covenant House Toronto team. We have Justin Sage-Passant, who is the Manager of Prevention Initiatives at Covenant House Toronto, and Andrew Crawford, who is a Family and Natural Supports Worker. Their presentation is entitled Affirming Acceptance, Effective Practices for FNS Work with 2S LGBTQIA+, Identifying Young People. Seems straightforward. And I'm circling them back.
Hi, folks. Good morning. Thank you for being here and thanks for your time. It's a real privilege to be here. I'm Justin. I use he, him pronouns. I manage the prevention programs at Covenant House Toronto, so I've led the implementation and continue to support our Family and Natural Support Program, the Youth Reconnect Program, and our Shelter Diversion Program. Really thrilled to be joined by Andrew.
That would be me. I'm Andrew. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a Family and Natural Supports worker at Covenant House working with Justin.
So we're going to talk a little bit about what we've learned works well in supporting young people that identify as 2S LGBTQ in terms of helping them strengthen their relationships to family, which is really the core of what FNS, Family and Natural Support Work, is all about. I'm not going to take up too much time. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes about what our program model looks like and why we do what we do, and then I'm going to hand it over to Andrew, who's really going to dig into what the practice looks like and share some of the learnings and some of those applications that hopefully you folks can take away and bring into your own agencies and with the youth you're serving. So I'm going to start with the bad news, unfortunately. Sorry about that. The bad news is that young people who identify as 2S LGBTQ who experience high levels of rejection from family are at much higher risk of experiencing depression and attempting suicide. This graphic, which is taken from the research by Caitlin Ryan at the Family Acceptance Project, shows us that young people that experience high levels of rejection are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide than young people that have low levels of rejection from family. And as Alex spoke about before, the main reason both 2S LGBTQ and the general population of young people that are experiencing homelessness enter into homelessness is because of some kind of breakdown or disruption in their family relationship. So that might leave us with an understanding that family can only be a part of young people's past, and it's probably been a very problematic part of their past. It's not part of their present, certainly not going to be part of their future. But when we listen to young people, a different narrative emerges. So what young people tell us is that family continues to remain very important to them, and they continue to stay in contact with family, sometimes through very challenging circumstances. We know from a survey that was done at Covenant House for youth accessing our services, 64% of young people identified that there was at least one person in their family that they remain close to, and 71% of young people had contact with family in the last 6 months. So there's room for us to think about not just how family perhaps has been part of the problem, but also how can it be part of the solution. And here's the good news. When young people do experience acceptance from family, their perception of themselves as a successful, happy, fulfilled LGBTQ2S adult is much, much higher than those that experience low rates of acceptance from family. And that's where our FNS program comes in, because that's what we're hoping to support young people achieve. So our FNS program, it's a voluntary service, and the objective is to support young people strengthen their relationships with community and immediate, extended, and chosen family members. And it's primarily a counselling service. So the FNS team are primarily counsellors, providing individual and family therapy, along with some systems navigation support, so helping young people and their family members get connected to resources in their communities. It's important to note that the services are for young people and their family members, because with the young person's consent, the family members are included in services to the same extent that the young person is. It's also important to note that family means different things to different people. So we'll follow the youth lead and how they define family, who are the important people to them. Our program launched in 2018. At that time, it was a demonstration project as part of Making the Shift. It was set up as a program to work across the youth shelter system in Toronto. So we established partnerships through YSIM, which is the Youth Shelter Interagency Network, which allowed us to have an integrated presence at most of the youth shelters in the city, the transitional housing programs, and also a couple of the drop-in programs. Supporting the development of the project, we did co-design with young people, we consulted with family members, we consulted with service providers, particularly service providers from the agencies we were partnering with, and we formed an advisory group from folks from those partnering agencies. Once the program was implemented, once we launched, that advisory group evolved into what we call our Champions Group. And the Champions Group is still running today. The Champions Group is made up typically of folks in frontline positions who really help with the integration of the FNS program at their individual sites. So they help coordinate when the FNS counsellor comes on site, what activities the FNS counsellor might be doing, what sort of things they might be joining in with. They might be the go-to person for other staff members to go to if they have questions about what the FNS program is. They might be the go-to person for young people that want to learn more about the program. I think that's enough from me. I want to save the time for Andrew because his stuff is really about the real work. So I'm going to hand it over to him now. And thank you for your time.
Hi again. So, I'm going to start us off by talking a little bit about the importance of developing a working relationship with family members. So the idea behind this is basically the same as it is for working with youth. Families are going to be talking to us about something vulnerable, right? In a sense, they're going to be kind of inviting us into their family life. Like, it's not exactly like going to the barber. So trust is what happens when we feel safe enough to be vulnerable with another person, and that trust leads to open and meaningful collaboration. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how myself and the folks on my team work to create that trust. I want to note that I'm going to be talking a lot about parents, but what I say could also be applied to anyone that the youth identifies as family. So the first thing is recognizing that they are doing their best. Parents care about their children. They may be struggling, they may feel lost, they may need some support, but they are doing their best. And when we connect with them, we treat them with the same compassion, empathy, and non-judgment that we extend to youth. Right? So think about the last time that you opened up to somebody about something and you felt judged. Like you may have felt guarded or defensive. It's not really a great place to start from. Right? And when we meet with them, we ask them a very important question basically out of the gate. And that question is, how are things going for you? And when we listen to the answer, we listen to understand. Like we want to know how things are going for them, like how they think, how they feel, what their perspective is. The parents that we meet with are often overwhelmed. They've got things going on like outside of the stuff with the youth. They often want the support. And when they see that we're willing and able to meet with them and sit with them, understand them, connect with them, that goes a really long way to having like a great working relationship. And when we talk to them about their 2S LGBTQ youth, we often hear the same sets of things. So we hear things about stigma, concerns about how stigma might impact the youth or the family, and we hear things about uncertainty. So things like, how do they know for sure? Or is this just a phase? And if you listen, you'll hear like underlying all of this, like a thread, is worry. Right? It's parental concern. And we let them know that we hear this concern. We might say something like, it sounds like you're really worried about the youth or the family member. And when we talk about it, we frame it for them like that. Like we talk about it like it is parental concern. We establish that as a frame. Some of the youth that we work with are in a bit of a hurry to get their parents on board with their 2S LGBTQ identity. And a reason for that, well, one reason for that is that by the time they've come out, they've often been thinking about this for a long time. So they're here, and they're often ready to go, like immediately. But the thing is that when they've come out, it's often news to the people around them. So they're here, but their parents are over here or over there somewhere. Right? Like they need some time to process and some time to catch up. So we need to meet them where they're at. Parents can have worldviews about what it means to be LGBTQ. They may not know very much about gender or sexuality. They may not realize, for example, that a youth can lead a happy and fulfilling life and be LGBTQ. Or they may question if they've done something wrong as parents. So within the context of that trusting, working relationship we've established, we provide education on LGBTQ stuff. If you feel prepared to do this on your own, that's great. If not, there's lots of resources to kind of develop that capacity. Justin was mentioning earlier the utility of like community partnerships. So if there's an organization in your area that works with LGBTQ folks, that could also be a great partnership to develop for capacity building or referrals. But when we see that parental concern, we can see that negative reactions to a youth's LGBTQ identity are actually meant to be protective. It's a way of saying, I think that this is dangerous and I'm worried about you. I don't know how things were for you when you were like 16 or 22, but if someone had told me that I couldn't do something that I wanted to do, it probably wouldn't have stopped me. It might have delayed me, or it may have pushed me to do it in secret. Right? So it would have pushed me away. So telling the youth that they can't do something like this is probably not going to work. What it is going to do is it's going to communicate rejection, which, as Justin was saying, has a very prominent impact on youth mental health. There's plenty of evidence to show that family rejection increases risk for youth. So mental health, self-harm, substance use, unsafe sex, and so on. Whereas like a good relationship, a good connection to a family member promotes well-being. Acceptance and rejection can be communicated in a number of different ways, some of them more subtle than others. So saying to a gay identified youth, I love you no matter who you love, communicates I accept you. Whereas asking the same youth if they have a girlfriend yet, communicates, but I'm not really sure that you're gay, which implies I think it might be better if you weren't. And parents can often do a mix of these things without even realizing that that's what they're doing. We found that parents may not fully recognize how the youth interprets what they say or do. So we talk to them about how they interact with the youth around their identity, and we draw this connection between rejecting words and actions and mental health. And we also point out how that can push youth away. A key takeaway or principle of FNS work is that a good relationship with a family benefits youth in general, LGBTQ or otherwise, and that relationship is a surefire way that parents can protect them. Parents don't necessarily need to understand the youth's identity. They don't even need to accept it if that isn't where they're at yet. A shift from one side of the slide to the other slide, or even not doing something that communicates rejection, can have a big impact on youth mental health and on the relationship between the youth and the family. So to those of you who have children, or whose siblings have children, you probably talk about your sons or your daughters or your nieces or your nephews. And like these are identities, and they shape the way that we see the youth. They shape our specific relationship to the youth. And like our expectations for the future. Like you might expect them to grow up and have kids. So when a youth comes out, it can be experienced as a loss. Right? A loss of how we see the youth, a loss of like how we see our relationship. And so family members can experience grief. And grief in general is something that I don't think that we're generally very well equipped to identify or work through. So like being able to point this out to family members can help them to understand and contextualize that experience, which is an important first step to being able to work through it. All right, so I'm going to have a drink. And then I'm going to talk to you about some important intersectionalities that have come up in our work. So the first one is neurodiversity. There is mounting evidence to show that neurodiverse youth are more likely to be non-binary or transgender, and that has absolutely been reflected in our experience. It's important to recognize for a couple of reasons. The first being that neurodiverse youth may have specific needs. They may have sensory needs. They may process and communicate emotions and information a little bit differently. They may struggle with emotional regulation. So being able to see this and having a sense of how to work with it, just generally speaking, is helpful for being able to work effectively with the youth. In terms of like working with families too, particularly where it's not really recognized within the family, that can kind of have a presence within the family dynamic. For example, or relatedly, we've noticed that the parents of neurodiverse youth can have specific concerns about them changing their mind or being influenced by peers. So there's this extra layer of protection kind of worked in there. And the youth in these families can also often feel a bit overwhelmed, especially when it comes to their identity and their family. And they may find it a bit challenging to describe their experience and their needs. So being able to create a space in which you can kind of build up to that youth being able to express that, to self-advocate, so to speak, within the family, can help them to kind of communicate and connect around that and to work together a bit better on it. So a quick story. I hope it'll be quick. So I worked with a youth who was trans and neurodiverse, and I noticed a very clear relationship between their changes in their mental health and their experience of invalidation within their family. And their father was in a position of saying kind of like, I don't get it, I'm not sure if I can accept it right now, but I could maybe get behind it a bit better if I could see that the youth was confident in what they were doing. And that was a piece that was just really hard for the youth to manage. So we met as a family. We met the three of us, and I drew the connections between the rejecting behaviors and mental health, and like that had a very like visible impact on the father. They were very visibly moved by that, and it led to an important conversation because he turned to the youth and he said, like, how can I support you better? And that led to the youth opening up more about how they've been impacted by certain interactions in the family. And it was very clear that they had never had this conversation before. This was something that they had a really hard time talking about. And so I supported them to have a conversation between the two of them about what got in the way of being able to communicate and how they could support each other to communicate better, how they could support each other around the youth transition. So the second intersectionality I want to talk to you about today is culture. Families can have very clear cultural expectations for sexuality and gender expression. And I want to note that those expectations extend beyond the family. Like aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, social groups, community. They will all have cultural expectations of the family, including the youth and including the parents. And so when you come into the picture, depending on your culture and their culture and your sense of cultural competency and so on, there may be a gap that you need to bridge. Because cultures have language, and like words have like cultural context. Like the word lesbian can have very different connotations depending on which lexicon you're using, so to speak. And so, and you wanna meet them where they're at, and you wanna understand kind of where they're coming from. Like if they're gonna go from here to here, it's gonna have to be in a way that resonates with them. Okay. So don't be shy. If you feel like culture is a part of it, then ask about culture. Ask them what LGBTQ or whatnot means within their culture. And like bring that into the conversation. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk to you about is shame. Everyone loves talking about shame. Supportive community is a huge resiliency factor for LGBTQ youth. It supports them, it connects them to belonging, acceptance, and within an LGBTQ specific community, it also gives them a chance to connect with people who have similar experiences. We can, I think like Alex and, I'm sorry, I forgot. Nicole, thank you. We're talking about like the value of being able to sit with people who understand you, So we found that youth who have a hard time or who are hesitant to connect to a supportive community, that often comes down to shame. Shame prompts us to withdraw. It prompts us to hide the parts of ourselves that we're ashamed of so that other people can't see them. And one of the best ways to combat shame is to talk about the things that we feel shame about. If you can do this within a safe context, it supports you to recognize that maybe it wasn't so bad. And that takes the power away from shame. Some youth may not be there yet. I worked with one youth for a year before she told me that she was queer, and it was another 6 months before she could talk about it. And that's fine. We work at the youth space. But when or if they feel comfortable, you can talk about it. Talk about them being LGBTQ, and be affirming. You might be the first person or one of the first people that the youth has come out to. And simply being someone who can talk to them about it in a way that just kind of conveys that it's okay can have a lasting impact. And when you see shame, talk about shame. I've worked with plenty of youth who did not know what shame was. They often conflate it with guilt, which is not the same thing. Talk about shame, talk about what it does, talk about what it is. Ask them about the messages that they've received about being LGBTQ. And help them to connect that to like their own experiences of shame, like how they may have internalized that. Being able to identify shame helps you to separate who they are from how they feel about that part of themselves. It's kind of like a way of saying, like, maybe there's something wrong with me. This is just kind of a part of how I feel. I'm going to wrap up with one more story. So I worked with another youth who was queer and trans, and they experienced a lot of shame. And it had a very clear impact on their mental health. Their plan for transitioning, I would briefly summarize, is trying to do it for as long as possible without telling anybody. And I won't go into what that would look like, but you could imagine that would be exceptionally difficult, if not impossible. And trying to think about how to do this caused them a lot of distress. And there was multiple reasons for this, but two of the big ones kind of came down to the belief that nobody would accept them until they were well into their transition. And that was the point at which they would be able to accept themselves. And so we had a conversation about that. We talked about shame and what it does and how it may have shaped the way that they saw themselves and the way that they expected that other people would see them. And we asked a question, which was, how will you learn to accept yourself if you don't give yourself the opportunity to experience acceptance from others? And they thought about that, and they went out and they built up an LGBTQ community. And I met with them not long ago, and they told me that things were going very well, like much better than they ever thought that they would. And that one of the biggest contributors to that was having built up an LGBTQ community. So that's us. Thank you for listening. Feel free to reach out to us. That's the Family Acceptance Project. We've cited that throughout the presentation. It's an excellent resource. I highly encourage it. And we look forward to questions and conversations.
Thank you for that. We'll now take questions. I just ask if you could come up to this microphone, or if you have mobility issues, just give us a wave. We can bring over the microphone. We just need to use it so that the translation services will work, and that everyone from joining from home or watching later can hear you. And same with my presenters. I also need to make sure that we're responding into the mic too. Thanks.
Okay, Alex, I have a question for you specifically, or you two. Some advice, actually. So one of your recommendations was around asking young people who present for services around their sexual identity. I think a lot of shelter staff could get on board with the gender identity, but sometimes we get pushback around that specifically. So what would be your advice and talking points on why it's important to do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I do feel a bit mixed about that advice, to be honest with you, because I think that there is a time and a place to collect that data, and I think there are certain spaces where we should be collecting that data, but we're not, like certain surveys, you know. Oh, is this not working?
They both are on all the way, so just bring it up next.
Oh, okay, sure, yeah.
You take it off the stand.
Oh, it's okay. So, yeah, I think that there are certain spaces where we have to be asking these questions because we need the data, and we need the data to understand exactly like these numbers. Sometimes we use really outdated stats. We don't know who's experiencing homelessness in, you know, particular places, and so then we cannot create services that would be appropriate to meet the needs of the folks who need, you know, who need those services most. But I do think it's yeah, when it comes to like accessing a shelter, like an emergency shelter overnight, on the intake form, like I do think asking about gender identity for sure, and like you said, people are on board with that, and that makes a lot of sense. I could see there's like, you know, people being more hesitant around asking about sexual orientation, and so I think that, I mean, it's the same reason that it's important to collect, whether it's on a point-in-time count survey or at an intake, because you want to know who's accessing the survey, who's accessing the program, right? And if we don't ask these questions, then there is no way for us to, you know, to know unless we ask the questions. And so I think that it's important, like if we are going to include those questions, you know, as sort of standardized questions on intake, that it should be explained to every youth in sort of a youth-friendly way, like, why are we asking the question? You know, sorry if it feels a bit invasive, but like, this is why, there's no judgment, and it's just literally for our data, we want to be able to make our service the best that it can possibly be to, you know, to meet your needs.
That's perfect, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh. Great job, everyone, by the way.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Really enjoyed the presentations. Excellent. I'm actually going to ask two questions, but for both different presenters. On the first question, Alex, I was wondering, Sean Kidd and others did a study on youth moving into transitional housing and being there was sort of a peak in sort of happiness and mental well-being, and then a really drop once people were actually housed in transitional housing, which eventually over time tended to come back up to more of a sort of more moderate state. Are you I don't know if their study has gone on long enough that would this be something that you're seeing when you're seeing the mental health? Like, is it?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Certainly, that is something that we have noticed, and we did report that just in terms of some of the questions around anxiety and depression in particular. We did see a decrease in anxiety over time. Like over time, it didn't go back up; it actually went down. But then with depression, we did see that depression actually got worse over time. And I think that there are a variety of reasons for why that might be the case. And we've seen this before, specifically with suicidality in another transitional housing program that we were evaluating. And the reason for that was like as people get closer to their move-out date, I think there's a lot of anxiety and worry about like, where am I going to go next? You know, I'm in this like safe and affirming space. I don't have to worry about my safety. This is an amazing place to be, but I can't be here forever. And so there's that worry that starts pretty early, I think, for folks not knowing where they're going to go next. I think that is one of the reasons why we do see that increase, maybe even in depression for youth at inclusion. I think that's one reason. I think another reason is the piece around family. And I know that, I'm thinking about the inclusion program. You know, it's a very small program, so it's not like we have all this data. But there are a number of youth who have very all of the youth really have complex relationships with their families. And I do think that impacts, like it's impossible for us to say what impacted exactly that increase in depression, but I do think that would have an impact. And then there's another reason that, I don't know if you want to talk to that reason. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of times when youth are struggling with places to live, you kind of go into that fight or flight mentality. feeling like I don't know what my next step is, I don't know where I'm going to sleep, I don't, like, those needs take such priority. You finally have a place to sleep, you know that you get to be there for a little bit, you get to settle, but with those feelings of settling, not worrying about your day-to-day needs being met, it's like I can finally feel the other things that have been put on back burner. Again, like, it's speculation, but like, it's one of those things that we think a lot about.
No, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
For the other side of the table, I had a question. I mean, I'd love to hear more. I think it's so important to address the fact that shame is such an overwhelming, both emotion and visceral experience, which I don't think services are well designed to be able to address. My personal view is that services are excellent at transactions. We're very good if you need something physical, we can make that transfer to you, but we really lack an ability to address emotion in an authentic way, which is why I think family and natural supports is so, because I think that really is the role for family and natural supports as opposed to social services. So I'm just wondering, but there's that middle ground. Where does the social service start and stop, and where does family and natural supports start and stop in that, and specifically around shame, because I do think that's a central factor to why people don't reach out to family and also don't access service in a way, even though we've offered it, and we tried to offer it in the most open way possible, which I think was the point you're making, which I think was just so important.
Okay.
It's a great question, Mike. I think when we think about family and natural support work, the goal is for young people to have at least one caring adult in their life, so they are not dependent on professional services. So the goal of family and natural support work is kind of to do ourselves out of a job. We want the social support network to be the reliable, dependable resource for the young people, not us as homelessness service providers. And I often reframe that goal of helping young people be independent to let's help them be independent from our services. Do you want to speak a bit more about the shame stuff?
Yeah. I think, I mean, I think, what I do is definitely like clinical social work. But I think that there's definitely space for social services to be able to, like having had a background in like shelter and like social services and such also, I think that there is definitely space for those services to maybe, you know, even in some like very simple, basic, casual ways, just having some space for some things like this. So like even like connecting with a youth who is experiencing shame, like just being able to sense from you that you are a safe person that they can talk to, who will not be critical of them, who will be open to like holding some space for what they're experiencing, can help them to access like even a little bit like from you when they're ready. And just being able to talk to them, you know, like it doesn't need to be like very involved. It doesn't need to be anything like complicated or even clinical. Just like about that, just that like basic like human connection.
Well, hi, I had a question for all of you. So I was wondering, I know that the sense of community is really important, and I was wondering if there were some opportunities eventually for you to get involved and contribute in the different services, like a peer support base or something like that.
Sure. I think that's an excellent question, and I do know for the inclusion program with Blue Door, that is certainly something that they had explored. As I had mentioned, that there was like a basement space that they had renovated, and I think that the initial idea had been to perhaps hire a peer worker or a youth maybe who completed their time at inclusion, and perhaps they could take on the role as a peer support worker. But there's a lot of, I think, challenges with that. You know, a number of challenges, like who do you select, and it just like so many things came up, but so that that hasn't happened yet, like not to say that it's not going to happen, but I do think it's hard to say like in what ways like youth, the small group of youth that we've been working with, like that, you know, in what ways they've contributed to community, because I think for many of them they have been in more of a sort of crisis mode and just like coming down like, oh, okay, I've got this like safe place to live, and starting to think about what next steps are. So I can't really comment exactly on in which ways, but I do know that that's something that youth have definitely thought about from day one, actually, from our very first kind of like intake baseline interview. I recall youth talking about like, oh, you know, my future goals. I want to help youth who are in the same situation that I've been in. And I think that's something that we've actually heard across the board, not just during this project, but so often youth want to give back and share, you know, with support youth who are in similar circumstances.
It's
Hi.
part, as part of our FNS program, we don't have a peer support component. The program was co-designed with young people. Almost 100 young people consulted on how we should run this program and how we should set it up. So that their voice was very, very much involved in that and very much taken with the seriousness that it should be. We would love to have an ongoing youth advisory. We just haven't been able to get it together yet. I should accept responsibility for that. In terms of supporting youth connecting to peers, we would refer out there. Some of our partners specifically serve the 2S LGBTQ communities, so we've got good relationships there that are helpful. It's also important to consider in FNS work peer support for parents. Again, it's not something we offer in-house, but we've built referral partnerships with a number of support groups for parents where they can come together with other parents that are going through somewhat similar experiences.
Hi, thank you so much for both of your presentations. They were very lovely. I have two questions. The first one, I know you folks in the first presentation did talk about how something the youth said that they would like more of is that support after inclusion. I'm curious to know like what the exit process of the supportive housing program looks like. And like if most of the youth have went into like independent housing or what that has looked like. And then my second question, I guess, is I'm just curious if any of you have recommendations for specific trainings or anything for staff. Because like, for example, like I am a very like visibly genderqueer person, and so I've had many clients who have come out to me where they haven't come out to anyone else before and who are chronically homeless and obviously don't feel necessarily safe to be their authentic selves. So I'm just curious on like if you have any suggestions on creating that environment in like a non-specifically like queer organization or program.
Okay. I'll just go to the first question. I might need you to get back to the second question after, but so in terms of the project, there haven't been that many youth who have moved out because it is like, you know, we're just in year 2 right now, and as I had mentioned, it's about 4 youth, and so they're there for about a year, sometimes over a year. So we have seen a few youth move out, and it hasn't been the same across the board. Like there have been youth, I think in one case, where a young person may have like gone back home to their family home just for a short period of time. Another young person went to school to like finish their education. And then in another case, you know, there have been young people who have moved on to like a different type of a program if they received like a bursary, like to support, living in a different type of housing program. And in terms of the move out process, like the program is involved in that process, of course, but I think it's kind of determining how much involvement is necessary or wanted after youth move out. Like it's one thing to be involved in that move out process to support youth and sort of figuring out next steps, but then it's like I think in some cases, because the program is so highly independent, that you know, some people don't want to have that involvement afterwards. And then it's also finding ways to actually engage youth once they've moved on and they're getting involved in different things. So it's like knowing, I think the program is still trying to figure out like how involved to be and how to engage youth on an ongoing basis afterwards. And so because we have remained in contact with not all of the youth who have moved out, because in some cases they, you know, after they've participated in the evaluation, they want to participate with us. Like, you know, they want to be interviewed or like complete surveys for up to a year. But then in other cases, they're just like, no, like I'm done. Thanks, I've contributed. Now I'm done. And so in the cases where youth have remained in contact, they've been like really sort of open and like every 3 months, every 3 or 4 months, they complete the surveys and will meet us for an interview. And so even now with the ending of the project, like we're going to have a focus group with youth who are living in the program, but then we're also inviting youth who moved out. And we weren't sure like that engagement, will they want to come back? Are they done? But I think in most cases, like everyone is really open to wanting to come back and participate in that focus group, which I think is a great sign. But I do think that this is something like to consider in terms of like, for how long after do you remain engaged? Does the program remain engaged? Such a small program, remain engaged with the youth who move out. And I don't know if Alex is here from the program, actually, so perhaps he could contribute a bit.
Thank you so much. Yeah. It is quite tricky, I think, when we're looking at what the next step is for inclusion. We've been very fortunate that we've had really great partnerships in the community, and one of those partnerships is the local CMHA, and they have a Housing First program for youth. And I know that we've seen at least 2 or 3 youth move from inclusion to those programs. And in terms of being able to stay connected, we're very, very flexible with that. I think the youth have been able to build quite a long-standing relationship with us as a team, and we see that that they tend to stay connected with us informally. And we are trying to build that community over time too. And Alex mentioned the inviting them back to the evaluation, but we've also invited them back to the house to celebrate different important dates, for example. And I think when we look at the relationships that they've built through the house, it's not just with the 2 or 3 youth that they're living with at the time. I think a lot of the youth are building relationships with the current youth that are staying with us in the program as well. Don't know if that makes sense.
Mostly, I was just curious if you had any specific recommendations for like training or anything for staff in general, just so that they're able to provide better support to clients.
Sure, like 2S LGBTQ. Yeah. I think that today, especially, there are a lot more training and education options, and some really great and accessible training options. Like I'm thinking specifically, about in Ontario. So for example, like Rainbow Health Ontario, they offer some really amazing trainings for different environments. So whether that be within the healthcare environment for staff, or whether that be in the shelter environment. And I think that they're very open to like meeting with the team beforehand and just hearing about what are your training needs, and then they can accommodate that. And I think that the options are also whether it be virtual or they can come in, do a session. It could be like over 2 sessions. So that's one option. I definitely recommend checking out the RHO website because they do have some great courses. And then the 519 in Toronto is another great resource, and they have their education and training department. And I've actually done some work with them to develop a training workshop specifically for shelter services focused on youth, 2S LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness. And so we've delivered that in a number of different ways. Like we've traveled to Ottawa, for example, and like spent a day with staff there. But then also the Toronto Training Hostels Center, which is an amazing resource as well. I mean, they offer like so many different types of training. And so we've offered that training through their center. I think that the trick is like, it's great that we have all these training like options. But the other thing is, like, how do you get people to actually come to the training or like, agree? Because I think oftentimes the people who agree to get trained are maybe the ones who don't need it as much as the people who are more reluctant. So it's like, how do you enforce that? I think that's something that we've really struggled with. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I have a question for the researchers, actually. If I had a bunch of money to give you to do research on anything on this field, in this topic, what would you suggest that the research, like, what research is really needed in this space? Like, what would you love to put that money towards?
I mean, I think that there's so much that we still don't know, and so there's like so many different things that come to mind. But I think the first thing that, to me, that feels really important is looking at this issue from a national perspective. I think that there's been some really great like surveys and research where we've looked at youth homelessness nationally, but we really haven't taken a closer look at like the experiences of 2S LGBTQ young people who are street involved, experiencing homelessness across Canada, and how those experiences vary across the country. And that's something that my team and I are very interested in conducting, and we have submitted for a proposal. So hopefully it gets funded. It's not like the full national project yet, because that's a really big project to take on, but we're hoping to start off just a bit smaller and then start off with a pilot with I think about 4 or 5 provinces. And so I do think it's important, because like even these stats that we provide, they are like quite outdated in many cases, and that's because we haven't collected the data across the country, and so we don't we really don't know like what does that look like? How do we measure this problem, and is it actually like these stats might be really quite higher. In some cases we say about 25%, but maybe it's actually closer to the 45% mark. Like we don't know, and we won't know until we really take a closer look at this issue across the country.
This is a question for you at Covenant House. How do you position family and natural support programs in terms of prevention? Meaning, who is referred to you, and what kind of outcomes do you have in terms of prevention, however it is defined?
I think this is one for me, eh? Yeah. Okay. So when we launched as the MTS demonstration project, the Family and Natural Support Program fitted at the tertiary end of the prevention continuum. So thinking about working upstream to prevent young people entering into homelessness, somewhere in the middle, think about early intervention to divert from entrenchment in shelter, and then tertiary is about supporting sustained exits to prevent returns to homelessness. So that's where it fitted when we launched in 2018. It was about supporting young people exit homelessness in a sustained way, with the understanding that if they could have supportive relationships, they're less likely to bounce back into homelessness. Things have grown since then. We now have what we call our Youth Reconnect program, which is an upstream homelessness prevention program. It works with a slightly younger age group. And it's intended to support young people and families before the young person needs to touch the emergency shelter system. And as part of that Youth Reconnect program team, we have an FNS counsellor as part of that staff team. We've also now got our diversion program. And when we think about shelter diversion for young people, it's less about eviction prevention, and it's more about maintaining stability in the family home, or helping young people access housing with family, whether that's immediate or extended family. So our diversion program refers a lot to Andrew's team of FNS counsellors. So the short answer is it fits across the prevention continuum. In terms of outcomes, the last 12 months, so that would have been July 1st last year to end of June this year, those that were housed at intake to the FNS program, 97% remained housed. Just over a third identified that their relationships with family improved. And those that were homeless at intake to the program, about 42% exited homelessness. About half of those exited homelessness for a family home. The interesting thing there is that the young people that exited homelessness for a family home, that wasn't their goal at intake to the program. They weren't talking about living with family. That was not on their radar at all. What they were talking about was, I've had a difficult relationship with this person. It's really hurting me now. I want to process that. When that happened, then there became the interest in, well, actually, perhaps this is an option for me to live with them. It doesn't have to be a forever option, but it might be a stepping stone to me getting my own place.
Great presentations, thanks so much. I have a question for each of the presentations. So, Alex, you made that great point at the beginning about how it can be hard for 2S LGBTQ folks to find services that speak to multiple parts of their identity, this intersectional kind of piece. And so I'm just curious if that came out in your conversations at all, or if there was any successes in terms of Blue Doors program, in terms of kind of speaking to those multiple aspects of identity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I honestly, as I was talking about it, it's not something that has necessarily come out in this project, and that could be because of, this is we're talking about like 4 youth. This is very, very small, and so it doesn't really represent like all of the work that we do, of course. So in this case, I can't speak to a time that it came up, but we also haven't necessarily looked at the data longitudinally. Like we're just looking at it in sections, like every 3 to 4 months or so. So it could be something very well that does come out when we start to analyze the data like much deeper and like look at it across the 2 years. But yeah, unfortunately, no, I can't share anything with you about that at this point. Yeah.
No, it was really interesting. I just can imagine it too on the kind of social side of it. If you have those sort of 4 people and they're sitting around the table eating breakfast, if someone sort of looks like them and things like that, and that might have been sort of one of the first times they've met a person who's sort of at their unique intersection. And so I was just wondering if anything it sort of was bouncing around in that kind of informal.
Yeah, no, not that I'm aware of. No.
And then for the Covenant House folks, great presentation. I was just kind of curious if you could speak a little bit to what I imagine to be sort of a spectrum of kind of contact and reconnection. Like I think sometimes when you think of family reconnection as coming out of sort of this kind of FNS services, it's sort of kids returning home. But I imagine in a lot of cases that process of reconnecting is very slow, and there's quite a spectrum there. And maybe I'm off base.
It is indeed quite a spectrum. Sometimes it takes a long time, and it's just like talking to family more regularly, maybe going to visit them instead of just texting every now and then. Sometimes it's surprisingly quickly like moving back into a family home. I think it's very individual. It's very complex. Relationships are very complex, maybe particularly family relationships. So it's always a bit of a journey, and you're never quite sure where you're going to end up.
Fair enough. If you don't mind, just a quick follow-up. Do you have situations where the family isn't interested to engage with the young person? You have a young person who wants to engage, but the family's just not there at all. And do you have any sort of strategies?
Can you think of any?
It happens.
Okay.
We always leave the door open. Like, things can change. Nothing's ever fixed forever. In Toronto, we're seeing a significant number of newcomers and refugees in the shelter system. A lot of those young people are coming to Canada unaccompanied, so families not in the country. So what does FNS work look like for that population? Some of those young people are coming to Canada because of their LGBTQ identity and not being safe in their home country, and their families not being safe if they stayed in the home country. Some of those folks are accessing our services to make sense of that. That's a difficult experience. There's a lot of survivor guilt. There's a lot of what does this mean now that I'm separated from the people that are most important to me? What does this community, belonging, family mean for me now that I'm here? So that work might be very individual, one-to-one with the FNS counselor. Often that work focuses on helping the young person establish their new sense of community now that they're here in Canada.
Great, thanks so much.
Hi everyone, great presentations. This is for both Alex and Nicole. In designing your program evaluation, can you talk about why you decided to do like an every 3 or 4 month like data collection as opposed to like beginning and end, for example? And then both the benefits and challenges you've seen so far with it.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. Well, I would say that in terms of like developing the evaluation framework, we did work very closely with the program to sort of design the project and to also meet the needs of the program and what they were looking for. And I think from their perspective, they weren't looking for something where it's like, okay, we'll see you in 2 years and we'll hand you our report. I think they were very interested in really wanting to implement changes as quickly as possible. And that's certainly a new way of doing this. I think in the past it has been like much more sort of like hands off in that way, where it's just like, okay, like here's like maybe like a preliminary report and then like an end of study report. In terms of challenges, I mean, it's a lot. Like, we're asking for a lot from the young people who live at the program. And the fact that it is such an independent program, I think that was something that we had to really find a way to respect the independence and the privacy, and didn't want to feel like we were constantly asking youth to contribute, because they have so much going on that, you know, for sure there were like, I mean, most of the youth actually agreed to participate in the study, which I was surprised by. I thought that there would be more youth who'd be like, no, I don't want to do that. So I think there was only like maybe one young person who didn't agree to participate, which was really surprising over time. And yeah, I guess in terms of challenges, I think the biggest challenge was just trying to really respect the independence of the youth and the program, and not wanting to feel like we were just like interfering with their life, you know, when they're trying to work on so many other things. But everything really kind of balanced out in a really great way, surprisingly. Like, even, like, it's one thing, it's like every 3 to 4 months to be collecting the data, but then it's another thing that we also had this monthly survey. And so we tried to make sure that we weren't asking too much. Like, the monthly survey is literally 5 minutes. It just takes 5 minutes, and of course, like, youth would receive honorarium for every single time that they participate. And that would even like increase like with each time. So it's like a gift card that would increase by $5 every time they participate. So I think that's another, you know, incentive for them as well to participate. How did we land on 3 to 4 months? Well, I think that just really aligned with the developmental evaluation framework, because it's these sort of like constant cycles of collecting data, bringing it back to the organization. And so like every 6 months, then that's just like not enough collection. And I think that we learned pretty quickly that, you know, things were changing. Like 3 months, that's a long time for some of these youth. There was like a lot going on in their lives. And so every 3 to 4 months made a lot more sense than like every 6 months, for example, especially because the program was interested in receiving this type of feedback and recommendations as quickly as possible. Obviously, doing this type of in-depth data collection every month would be way too much, and I think that would actually disrespect their privacy in some ways, you know? So I think that we landed on the 3 to 4 months because it made a lot of sense to meet the program's needs, but also to respect the youth in the way that they should be respected.
Thank you, everyone, for your presentations. This question is for Andrew. I wanted to first thank you for the question that you shared. What does 2S LGBTQ plus look like in your culture? And you had kind of framed it as conditional, like if this is a factor that seems relevant in the relationship, that perhaps we should table it. But there are some underlying assumptions there about the if. And I thought, wouldn't it just be lovely if that was always a question that one asked? Because sometimes we make assumptions, particularly I think of, like a white secular person talking to another white secular person and assuming that maybe culture isn't a factor, or that there's underlying shared values or something like this, or perceptions. And I wondered if you had any examples of that, where that question has opened up kind of broader insights, or even created space for families to acknowledge some of their own assumptions, because it's a little bit further away. It's their culture, not just them as individuals or families.
I think that is a very good point. I think it is. I think culture is always relevant. I think families, individuals, we all exist within like these broader social contexts, and culture is always coming into it, like including your own culture, right? And yeah, I think I for example, I worked with one family. They were Greek. I think so. The youth's grandparents had immigrated from a small village in Greece, and I think it really felt like their attitudes towards gender and sexuality had like a really big impact on the youth's mother, and so on and so forth. I think being able to kind of talk to them about that piece, I think it kind of shifted the conversation a little bit in a kind of a subtle way, but it was kind of like recognizing, like putting a name to the cultural piece makes it its own entity. It's kind of similar to what I was saying about shame. Like if you can separate things a little bit, you can isolate like being LGBTQ from like a cultural conceptualization of it, which does create some more room for kind of like exploring different conceptualizations. Thank you.
I'll ask a similar question to what I asked the researchers, but if you were to get more funding for Covenant House Toronto, would you, no, but, well, okay, it's a little bit different, but would you just hire more FNS workers to do that in that space, or would you develop like certain aspects of the FNS program?
Yeah, both. So Andrew's team, who are really the FNS workers partnering with YSIN, so supporting the shelter network, there's 4 of them, and there are 7 emergency use shelters in the city of Toronto, plus 4 transitional housing programs and a number of drop-in programs. It's not enough. The team's at capacity. When we think about things from a prevention lens, going back to Cecile's question, having a wait list doesn't work very well for prevention. So if we had more staff, we could respond more immediately. We wouldn't be asking people to wait for a week or 2 or even a month before they could receive service. But yes, I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to think about how to expand the FNS approach across services. So not necessarily a specific FNS program, but how does a case manager in shelter think about how they're supporting youth with their goals from an FNS lens? How are they bringing in the importance that family might be able to play in how they're thinking about supporting youth achieve their goals? How does our drop-in program meet youth at the door from an FNS lens? How do we do intake into shelter? How are we supporting young people exit shelter or our transitional housing programs from an FNS lens? I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of growth to think about FNS as an approach, not just as a specific program.
And I know you have a transitional housing unit that's specifically for LGBTQ youth. Do you take a lot of the principles that they were talking about in the inclusion project to that, or is it just that they're all in a safe community together and can relate to each other, or are there specific programming that you do with that transitional house?
I'm probably not the best person to ask about that specific program at Covenant House. I know there was some intentionality in hiring in order to reflect the youth that would be accessing the services. With our program, the FNS program model, we've also, 2 of our partners are YMCA Sprott House and Friends of Ruby, who both operate transitional housing programs for queer and trans youth. Friends of Ruby also has a drop-in program, which offers case management and other counseling services. So we're kind of privileged in that sense of being a program that can learn so much from other programs that have the expertise there. We see an overrepresentation of queer and trans youth in our program. On a month-by-month basis, it's 30 to 60% of our youth identify as queer and trans. But I wouldn't say that our FNS program is the expert in meeting the needs of queer and trans youth. I think we need to partner to learn and do better there.
Okay. Any last questions, or should we break for, is it lunch now? Yes, okay.